Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar titled Market Concentration in the UK and the Effect of COVID-19 on Business Creation. The webinar is organized by the Productivity Insights Network, which was established in January 2018 and is funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. As many of you are aware, PIN is a network of social science researchers, and our main goal as a network is to advance the current debate on productivity, both in theory and practice. I'm Professor Vanya Sena, and I will moderate the session today. I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Anthony Savagar from the University of Kent. Anthony is a lecturer in macroeconomics and joined the University of Kent in 2016, and he previously studied at the University of Cardiff. His research covers macroeconomic, industrial organization, and dynamical systems, and he looks at how firms' behavior and industrial organization affect the business cycle dynamics. His recent work looks at the effects of productivity on firm entry and how it fosters competition as opposite to the impact on returns to scale. Before I hand over to Anthony, I have here the usual housekeeping items I want to cover. First of all, today's webinar will be available through our PIN website after the session. Next, if you have a question for our speaker, feel free to send it through the chat function. We will be answering questions at the end of the session. However, if your question is not answered during today's webinar, we will collect them and send an answer afterwards. Finally, we would like to encourage you to share today's webinar with your social networks. So, without any further ado, I'd like to kick things off by welcoming our speaker. Anthony, over to you.
Hi, Vanya. Thanks very much for the introduction. I'll share my screen now. Okay, can you see my slides just because we had some difficulties the other day?
We can, thank you.
Okay, so thanks for having me. It's sort of fun to be invited to give this talk. I'll speak about two things really that are related. Market concentration in the UK, which is a project originally funded by PIN, then I'm going to move on to some work that's very recent, sort of hot off the press, on how COVID-19 has been affecting business creation in the UK. So these are related in so much as business creation or firm entry is a determinant of market concentration, but most of the market concentration work will be pre-COVID-19, and in that we're trying to understand how market power in the UK is evolving by one particular measure. So yeah, as I was just explaining, general theme today is aggregate firm dynamics in the UK, and I'm coming at this from a couple of different projects. The first project is looking at concentration, which I'm working on with Oluwaseyi Naguda, Kyung-In Hwang, and myself. All of us are in Kent. And the second project is much more up-to-date data analysis of business creation in the UK with Alfred Duncan, Miguel Leon Ledesma, and myself, also in the University of Kent. So let's begin by looking at the concentration stuff. Oh, first I need to give some disclaimers to do with the data. So all of this work is, especially the concentration stuff, is work in progress. Results preliminary, and we're still doing some analysis. But more importantly, some of the data that we use in the concentration analysis is from the Office of National Statistics, and they're quite keen that this is emphasized. So I should read it out. This work was produced using statistical data from the ONS. The use of the ONS statistical data in this work does not imply the endorsement of the ONS in relation to the interpretation or analysis of the statistical data. The work uses research data sets which may not exactly reproduce national aggregates. And the concentration work is funded by Productivity Insights Network, who are hosting today's webinar. So to begin with, what got me interested in this topic? Well, there is a general belief at the moment that market power is increasing in many advanced economies around the globe, particularly in the United States. And teamed with that, the UK has a productivity puzzle, which is the whole reason that we have this productivity insights network. And one of the things that market power can do is to limit productivity growth through various channels that I'll discuss in a moment. So the idea here is to ask how much does one particular measure of market power, a controversial measure of market power, that is concentration, affect productivity in the UK. So I'll ask, have changes in UK market power affected productivity? And what I'm going to show in this short coverage today is, for the most part in the UK, concentration is flat to modestly increasing. So it's not like a huge result like in the United States, in the Philippon work, where you see massive increases in concentration. There are some increases, but they're not exceptionally aggressive. And I'll show that this rise in concentration is negatively related to labor productivity. I have other research that's, I suppose, more sophisticated, which looks at calculating markups and how they are related to productivity. But today I'm just going to focus on the simple measure, concentration, as that's one angle to go at things from. Concentration is well understood with policymakers and sort of general audiences, and it's easy to measure. So that's part of the motivation for looking at this is market power affecting productivity question through different economic measures. So just I'll quickly go over some of the existing work in this area. So the UK hasn't been covered anywhere near as extensively as the US has in recent times, but there are a few analyses out there. The first one that got into what's happening to concentration in the UK was by some researchers at the Resolution Foundation. They look at how much of the total sales in the economy the top 100 firms have. So they look at the so-called concentration ratio of the top 100 firms. And they show it's been increasing, again, quite modestly from 17% to 23% over a period 2004 to 2016. This is quite conditional on when you begin the data. So there's also work by the Bank of England, by Andy Haldane gave a speech at Jackson Hole in 2018. He showed a broad analysis of market power in the UK, showing that markups are rising as product market markups. Concentration, again measured by CR100, is increasing from about 20 to 28% from 1998 to 2016. And the data that they're using is slightly different to the data that the Resolution Foundation used. They have a large data set of publicly listed firms, whereas the Resolution Foundation are using similar data to us from the ONS, which we've updated to more recent vintages. And then there's other studies that aren't specific to the UK, but do include the UK as one country among many that they're studying. Tommaso Valetti presented something at the European Economic Association last year, showing that in Europe, mostly the concentration ratios are flat or modestly declining. The UK was included in that. Jan de Lucke and Jan Eekhout, who've done lots of work on markups in general. They kind of started this whole debate on, is market power growing in advanced economies? They have a paper on global market power that shows markups increased significantly in the United Kingdom. And then the people who've done lots of work on concentration is Germán Gutiérrez and Tomás Philippon, and they show that concentration in the EU is relatively flat compared to the US, which has been increasing a lot. So why do we care about concentration? I'll explain the sort of theory behind it first, and then there's a very superficial policy reason to look at things. That policymakers care about this at the moment. So the first reason is that there are concerns that concentration might hamper productivity. The channel through which that takes place are that it limits competition. So incumbents don't have to be as efficient as they otherwise would be. And it can create barriers to entry. So then in that case, if you have an increase in concentration, you would expect it to hurt productivity and have a negative relationship. And that's going to be what we find evidence for. But this is controversial. It's a well-known sort of reverse causal mechanism that, you know, you can have very high concentration in a market or in the whole economy if a number of firms are particularly innovative and they are moving at the frontier, they're more productive, and therefore they gain concentration, which is the sort of Walmart of the 1990s story. And that's been put forward by Outerdorn, Katz, Patterson, and Van Reenen. So this is an age-old sort of controversy in the theory. So what I'm going to do is, one way to identify between which of these is more important is to condition on entry rates. The idea being that if you're concentrating in a market with a healthy amount of entry, the negative effect of concentration will be much weaker, and that's indeed what we see. You're more likely to be picking up on a market that is in this second scenario than in this first scenario. And so moving on from this, based on, I think, some of the emerging literature that's been going on, the government in the UK have become quite interested in trying to study market power in aggregate. So this is a letter written on the 5th of February this year from now the former Chancellor of the Exchequer and the former Secretary of State to the Department of Business. So they've written a letter to the CMA, that's the UK's competition authority, to say we need to have a better understanding of market power in the aggregate. So this is the important distinction to understand between what's going on now and what's happened in the past, is that lots of recent studies by economists have focused on the level of market power in the whole economy. Whereas we've always been quite good and careful at monitoring individual markets, and so the gambling industry, for example, or another specific industry. We've always monitored market power in those industries, but now people tend to care about what's happening to the whole economy, to the macro economy, not just the specific microeconomic industry. So that's what this picks up on, and they asked the CMA to start producing a regular report on this. And the CMA's response is given here the next day by the Lord Tyrie in the Times, and so this is important because it draws in the productivity element. They respond by saying that analysis of aggregate market power will be brought together in an annual assessment, helping to inform the public debate on markets. They go on to say that it's important, and there's several reasons for that. The first one being that productivity has been weak since the financial crisis. So this is clearly something that the UK government is aware on and trying to investigate. Are we experiencing weak productivity because of, in part, changing market power? And they go on to recognise this is hard, and we need more robust evidence, which is, I hope, where we fit in on this relatively short project. So if you don't know, this is the UK productivity puzzle, as I see it. This is just data straight from the ONS of aggregate output per hour and output per worker, and this is the reason that this productivity insights network is in existence, I suppose. You see that in the UK, productivity is increasing pretty well over the 90s, 2000s, and then you get to the financial crisis and it goes off a cliff. So there's this big fall in productivity during the Great Recession. Sorry, can I just ask, can you see my cursor when I'm doing things with the cursor?
I can.
You can see it, yeah?
Yeah.
That's good. Otherwise, what I'm saying is not as insightful. Okay, so productivity falls a lot in levels. That's the first part of the so-called productivity puzzle, and then it takes ages to recover even in levels. So you're talking from 2008, 2009 up to 2015 just for levels of productivity to get back to pre-crisis levels. So to get from the 100 here back to the 100 is a long period of time. And this, of course, implies that there's also a growth problem. So if you were to run a line through this upward trajectory here, it would be much steeper than if you ran a line through this much shallower trajectory after the financial crisis. So we're trying to explain some of this so-called productivity puzzle. We'll look at levels today. I don't want to go too much into the kind of technicalities. I won't cover many technicalities today just because it's I'm told it's a generalist audience, but I think a little bit of data background is always useful. So we're going to use something called the Business Structure Database provided by the ONS, and this contains the universe of firms in the UK pretty much. So it exists for tax purposes. The great advantage is it is the near population of UK firms, 2 million per year. The disadvantage of that data set is that it's got a relatively limited number of variables. You have turnover, employees, sector, foreign ownership, birth, death, and postcode. And there's going to be a lag in reporting. So some of the observations you see will appear to be a couple of years later than you'd normally think of them taking place, just because of the way that data is reported to the authorities. So we analyze it, well, in the main paper we're putting together, we analyze the full paper, we analyze the subsample that removes finance, utilities, health and education, mainly because we have to use revenue as a turnover as a proxy for output, and these sectors are not so good at that mapping in those sectors is not very good. But it does allow us, it does provide a few proxies for competition, which we think is something that will affect productivity. So at the very crudest level, we've got a number of firms. We can measure the entry onto the register and the exit from it, which is an indicator of competition. And we can put together measures of concentration ratios, CR5, CR10, CR50, which is the market share, how much of total sales in a market do the top 5 firms, the top 10 firms, or the top 50 firms hold. Right, so if we first look at the data we've put together for entry and exit, you can see here that it all passes the smell test, that it looks as you would expect. So entry is relatively high over the 2000s, that's the blue line. It decreases a lot during recession, as you would expect. As I said, that you get quite slight lags in the data here. And it recovers as you start to come out of recession. Conversely, exit is pro-cyclical. It goes up during the recession and declines again afterwards. So during the recessionary period, you see much more exit than entry, which translates to this brown curve down here, where you see net exit during the Great Recession. And then, but there's positive entry throughout the 2000s, and there's positive entry over the 2012 plus period up to 2018. So we'd characterize this as weaker competition in these periods, a chance for incumbents to consolidate market power. This could be harmful for productivity, whereas periods like here and here are characterized by stronger competition. So when we calculate, these are just aggregate concentration ratios for the whole economy. We can do it by different sectors and weight up, or we can just look at the whole economy. Here we've done the simplest. Here I put the simplest one, which is, let's see how much market share the top 5 firms have, the top 10 firms, the top 20, and the top 50. And as you can see, it's relatively low. If you take the CR5, it's relatively low for the period over the 2000s. It increases a lot in the late 2000s in coincidence with the Great Recession. If you've just got the top 5 firms maintaining most of their sales, but the general whole market, so the whole economy declining, you're going to see artificially increases in the concentration ratio, and that retains its this increase for the period after the Great Recession. So you do seem to see some break here that indicates some consolidation of market power among the top 5, top 10, top 15, top 20 firms. And then there's these declines in the last 2 periods. So this requires some explaining. We're not fully on top of this one yet, but presumably there could be a Brexit effect, which is the size of the market decreasing, but the top firms in that market being relatively more robust to the changing economic conditions. So they've retained share, but the market in aggregate has declined. But then there could also be other measurement type issues to look at there. This just goes to show that when you do observe, our proxy for labor productivity is going to just be sales per employee, which is what we can get from the data, and it tends to show the same trend that we saw in the first ONS graph. So when you put together firm level data on this, you get something similar to the aggregate national accounts data that the ONS shows. You have increasing productivity over the 2000s, a big fall, and then low productivity for a number of years afterwards. And again, a big fall in the last few years. Okay, so I'm going to wrap this up and move on to the COVID stuff, but this is the main discussion of the analysis that we've done. So I perform a regression analysis to explain how concentration and other factors are related to productivity. Now, the main results from this analysis show that there is a negative relationship between concentration and productivity. So if you increase and it's statistically significant, which is important. So if you increase CR5, the concentration ratio of the top 5 firms, by 10 percentage points, which would be quite a large increase, you see a decrease in productivity of about 0.4%. So although it's statistically significant, the economic significance is pretty modest. There isn't a huge effect coming from a rise in market power, and that's quite a large rise in market power relative to what we've seen in here. A 10 percentage point increase would be one of the largest increases you've seen over this period. And as you broaden the definitions of market power to the Herfindahl index, which is something else you can look at, or the larger measures of the top firms, the CR10, CR20, the statistical significance will decrease. There's still significance there, but not at the 90% level. But CR5 is important. So CR5 has this negative effect on labor productivity levels. So the message really to take away is that concentration is associated with decreases in productivity over the period we study. We also do this thing of where we condition on high entry markets, and that was to sort of distinguish between these two types of whether concentration is an indicator that the market's less competitive and it's going to harm productivity, versus whether concentration is indicative of just a very productive set of firms acquiring market share. So by conditioning on entry, what you can see is that when you do have a market with a high level of entry that is at the same time concentrating, you don't need to worry about the effects of that on productivity in the economy. So, but when you take away the entry, or if you reduce the amount of entry, the negative effects of concentration are much higher. Net entry in general is a very important, it's strongly related to labor productivity. So you increase net entry by 1 percentage point, you see sort of 10% increases in productivity, and we control for things like age, size, and market share. So if I just conclude what we've looked at in the concentration analysis, we say that concentration trends in the UK tend to be much less aggressive than those in the US. Depending upon when you start and end your series, and it's the second point is we have a negative relationship between concentration and productivity, suggesting higher concentration is related to a lower level of productivity. But we do say the economic significance seems relatively modest. You need a very big increase in concentration to explain a relatively small fall in productivity. It's not negligible, but we saw levels decreases in productivity of something like 4%, 5%. So this would only be 1/10 of that. And lastly, I haven't touched on these market power measured by markups things today, but the evidence from our work, from the bank work, is that markups are increasing much more than we're seeing in concentration, and that needs to be explored further. So I was going to go on to the COVID-19 stuff now, Vania, but I can take, if there are any burning questions at the moment, I could take them now, or I can hold off until the end.
There are no questions at the moment from the audience, so if you wish, you can proceed with the presentation, and then we can ask questions at the very end. Oh no, actually, now questions. Okay, right. I got a question from Mike Stoyanov. It is interesting because the US have a high market concentration, but they are also one of the most productive countries, and their productivity recovered after the crisis. It's more of a comment than a question, but it's an interesting point because obviously there is a clear contrast between what happens in the US and the UK, and I wonder whether you have some thoughts to offer on this.
Yeah, I expect there are many factors that will affect why the US is a very productive economy in general. But when you hold many of those factors constant, if you just do look at so I don't think the US is, the thing with the US is how much concentration has increased from a relatively low level in the 90s to today. And if you impose that increase on the US, or if you look at the effect of that particular increase, that seems to have had a negative effect on productivity, according to this work by Germán Gutiérrez and Tomás Philippon.
Okay, there's a follow-up questions, and Jen Nellis is asking whether there are sectoral differences in the concentration that can explain the result. You found something?
Yeah, that's a great question. We have that analysis, and what I didn't put it in today, but what you see is that the services sector tends to see an increase in concentration.
Okay, there are no more questions from the audience. Probably we can proceed with the second part of the presentation.
Yeah. That's great. Thanks very much. So this is project 2, but also related, because as I said, business creation is an important determinant of the level of market power, whether that be in terms of markups, which is an easy theoretical relationship to draw, or whether it be concentration. When you have more firms entering, they compete with the existing firms. That tends to produce efficiency gains through competition. So business creation is really important. The nice thing here in this project that I'm doing with Alfred Duncan, Miguel Leon Ledesma, and myself in Kent, is that we can get really, really contemporary measures of business creation for the UK to understand how COVID and lockdown and the related policy interventions have affected business creation. And business creation is a great indicator of not only what's going on in the supply side of the economy at any given time, so it's a good early indicator in that sense, but it's also great because it's got real economic consequences. So whereas indicators like shipments and things like that might just be interesting for a very short period of time, looking at firm creation is going to have not just effects now and telling us what's happening to the supply side of the economy at a given point in time, but it will also tell us what might happen to employment in the future, productivity in the future, and growth in the future, because it's a pretty fundamental concept in economics. So here we analyze current data on business creation across UK regions and sectors. So you're going to see big inequalities emerging across the sectors of the economy and the different regions of the economy, and that ties nicely with what Phil and Richard did last week on the Friday PIN webinar. So we get our data from Companies House, which releases on a monthly basis really up-to-date figures on how many companies have been registered in a given month. And so that's great because it's when it's released, it's very near real time. And then of course it decays a bit over the month, but you have another update in a month's time. And we care about business creation for a couple of reasons. The first reason is, and the reason that got us looking at this was just, this is a really great indicator of what's happening to the economy, and we think it's more up to date than anything else. It covers the universe of firms, so you're not surveying particular areas or anything, it's the whole population. And not only is it a fast indicator, but it's an indicator with a serious economic meaning. It has long-run consequences for employment, so new firms tend to be big employers, so they're big job creators. They create much more jobs than they destroy, at least based on evidence from the US. So there's lots of evidence that these new firms or startups are important for employment. And there's also evidence that if you have a recession where there's a drop in firm creation, that has a long run effect on the level of employment many generations down the line. So it's called a lost generation of firms creates lost employment in the future. And so Petter Sedlacek, Vincent Sturck have done lots of work on this for the United States, and they find those results very robustly. Secondly, new firms can be innovative, they can create competition, and this drives productivity. And of course, some of the firms born today will be the highest growth firms in the future. So these are all important reasons to look at firm creation. And what I've been doing with Miguel and Alfred is to provide monthly updates on the state of UK business creation throughout the COVID-19 crisis. And our latest update, which is based on data all the way up to the end of June, so just 2 days old now, is going to be released later on today. So that should be on the Kent website in some form within a couple of hours. And I've got at least one of the analysis in the slides today for the latest data. So let's look at what's happening. This is the aggregate effect of lockdown on business creation or firm creation, companies registered at Companies House, relative to the same week last year. So you take any one of these bars and you can compare what business creation was in that week relative to the same week last year. If it were exactly the same as it were last year, then you'd be at the 100 mark, okay? So before lockdown took place on the 23rd of March, so 23rd of March. So that's around here in the middle of the plot. You can see that up to that period, business creation for the most part is around the same each week as it was the year before. So it's around 100% of what it was in that week the previous year. You get to lockdown and there's this dramatic fall in business creation. You see business creation going down to as low as 50%, 40% levels that we saw in the same week the previous year, particularly in the first 4 weeks of lockdown. So this is when business creation really dries up a lot. And then as you start to see some easing in the lockdown, we see a bit of recovery over the April and May months. So this is when things started to ease slightly. Some sectors were treated slightly differently, which is going to be interesting when we look at the sectoral effects. What the blue line shows is what's the average decline in firm creation since the 23rd of March relative to the same period last year. And you see it's down about 25%. It's down much more in the first 4 months. It's down about 40% in this period, first 4 weeks. And then it recovers slightly, but still well below the 100 mark. But what's really interesting is what we're going to observe this month, and that's going to be in our report later on today. So if we then look at how does this break down across sectors? This is looking again at business creation from the 23rd of March, when lockdown begins, to the 31st of May, so to the end of May. And you see that certain sectors, particularly those more service-orientated sectors, are really hard hit. Retail trade is the hardest hit. It's down. Business creation is down 35% in the retail sector, which is not surprising given shops until recently were all closed and there wasn't much activity in that area. And some of the more goods-producing sectors, things like mining, agriculture, manufacturing, they do much better, and that's probably because they were allocated as essential industries. The other thing to note here, which you can't quite see in this graph, but from our earlier report, so when we did the first month, we did March to the end of April, construction was really hard hit. So construction was the bar at the far left, and then the lockdown restrictions on construction were eased before other sectors. And what you've seen in the subsequent months, so throughout May, is this rebounding of construction to be a pretty mediocrely affected sector. So it leaps, it responds sharply to an easing of the lockdown, or to easing of the policies on that sector. Now we do the regional breakdown, and this is why Phil and Richard's talk the other day was really interesting. Now this is quite quite a stark result. So the profound thing is that all of the devolved countries, Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland, perform much worse than any of the English regions. Okay, so the business creation between the 23rd of March and the 31st of May, relative to the 23rd of March 2019 and the 31st of May 2019, is down massively in Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland, particularly in Wales, where you see 40% declines in business creation. The English regions are a bit more resilient, and particularly London is resilient, and that is why the explanation we had the other day from Phil makes some sense, that firms or companies redouble their continue their activities in their main location, and the peripheral areas suffer. Okay, and this is a map that broadly shows that as you move away from London, things start to get worse in terms of business creation. And all of this data was up to the end of May, and then we have this very last slide. I could just about fit this in, which is really breaking and a nice slide to finish on. And this includes the data for May and June. So this is data all the way up to 2 days ago. And what we see is that the recovery, so this is a time series plot now. So the x-axis is showing the months, the y-axis is showing your business creation relative to the same time period last year, relative to the same week last year. So what you see again is over the period before lockdown up to around the 23rd of March here, business creation is about the same as it was over the same weeks last year. You then see this rapid decline in line with the lockdown being implemented, and you start to see a modest recovery, but now things have really started to bounce back over June. So throughout June, if you imagine a line going through at the 100 mark, you'd be on the 100 mark if things were just as normal, right? If they were roughly the same as last year, you'd be having 100% of last year's creation this year. But you start to see now in the June results that things really are in overdrive. There's a big making up for the lost business creation over the more severe lockdown period between April and May. So you start to see this potential V-shaped recovery, at least in firm creation. This is, of course, just one indicator of many things in the economy. So that's quite an interesting start, and I think probably one of the most up-to-date indicators we have as of today of what's going on in the UK economy. So that's a big takeaway, and that's really everything. I'll just wrap up. The project I've just discussed on firm creation during COVID is about showing that a reduction in firm creation can have negative effects on employment and productivity in the future. So that's why we care about it, and it's important to look at. The descriptive statistics show that there's a clear inequalities emerging across regions and sectors. Goods producing sectors are reasonably more resilient than services, but we do also see the easing of restrictions is effective. So construction, for example, was really hard hit in March, April. In May, when they lifted the restrictions on construction, it rebounded very quickly. Devolved countries have suffered a lot more than the English regions, and London is the most resilient. And just we finished on this final slide, which is potentially good news. Breaking June data shows that there's a bit of a V-shaped recovery in business creation, and that's everything. So we've mainly just done descriptive statistics on this stuff, given the time.
Thank you very much, Anthony. It was very interesting. We have a couple of questions from the audience. Okay, couple are related to the business creation during the current crisis, and there is a question about the market power and increasing market power. Probably we can start from the COVID-related questions.
Yeah, let's do that.
And, we have one question from Michael, who asks whether registration at Companies House cover all firms. My understanding is that it covers limited companies, which tend to be larger. Might this therefore be an underestimation of the impact of COVID-19 on business creation, as smaller firms are likely to be impacted to a much greater extent? So should we be even more concerned? That's Michael's question.
I don't. So yeah, thanks. It's a good question. We were thinking about that at first, but all firms are being registered through Companies House, and then there's a division within that of the different types of structure. So we think it's very representative.
Okay. There is a related question from Colin Mason, who asks, what proportion of company registration are one-person businesses, i.e. no employees, freelancers? Do you know anything? What proportion of this registration can be self-employed or freelancers?
So there's no data on employment. So what we tend to do is to avoid what the question's concerns are to do with like zero employee firms, is to look at just percentage changes, assuming that that will be a fixed effect across the 2 periods. So we don't really look at the absolute numbers on this, which will be quite high.
Okay. And on the same topic, we have a question from Jen Nellis, who asks, what are the absolute numbers for business creation? When you're talking of a rebound, are these large numbers or are they relatively small? How do the absolute numbers differ by sector?
So they're high. The number of firms, you're talking thousands of firms. In the reports we put a number on the number of what we call missing firm creation. So how many firms are lost relative to the same time period last year, and it's something like 30,000. But you have to be careful with those figures, because a registration in Companies House might not be what we as economists think of as a genuine firm, as a production function that's going to employ people, employ capital, and produce stuff. It could be created for accountancy reasons or something similar. So that's why we're careful to use the percent changes in order to hold fixed effects like that constant.
We have another question, and basically it's Mike Stoyanov asking whether you plan to compare these results with the ONS data. And the registered companies in Companies House are not necessarily active, while the ONS uses VAT, so it includes only active companies.
Thanks, Mike. That's a useful comment. So unfortunately, the ONS stuff is delayed too much to say anything about COVID. It will be a natural thing to do going forward. So you're right that the figures that I presented on net entry, births, deaths in the first project would be more robust to being a firm that is one that's going to produce and employ and that sort of thing, compared to the Companies House data, which is an indicator of what's going on, but will include firms that are being created for, say, accountancy purposes. But yeah, we can compare them, but we won't have the COVID period available for a couple of years, so it limits us a bit.
Okay, fair enough. That's very good. We got one question from Torben, and this question refers to competition and the previous presentation. And Torben says, we will publish a similar study for Germany next week. We also find a moderate increase in market power. We use price markups on Aggregate and within the economic sector. And moreover, we see similar results with respect to productivity development. But in the service sectors, we see a positive relationship between the market power and the productivity in the service sector. Do you see similar trends in the UK service sectors?
I can't answer the last part, whether we have similar trends at the moment. I'm not sure. I need to check it. But it sounds like what you're doing is interesting, and this hypothesis of so I think what he's saying is that markups are going up, and that's positively rated. Probably he's talking about TFP. I don't know, but in Germany, and that would be consistent with this with the other hypothesis that some of these firms with market power are investing heavily in intangibles, and they're enjoying productivity gains because of that.
Okay. So you can't disentangle manufacturing from service in your data.
You could do that.
Okay. So I think this would be an interesting comparison to see what you find across the two large business groupings and see whether you have different results. Okay. I think I have a question from my end, and it's really about policy implications, and which is the standard question, presumably, at this point of every webinar. So what do you think the policymakers should do when looking at market concentration and the impact on productivity? You can argue that it's a good idea to favor some concentration because it may mean that the best firms, more productive, tend to basically survive, and they may enjoy some economies of scale, and there may be several reasons why they get bigger, and which may lead to increasing productivity.
Right.
So how would you answer this sort of comment?
Yeah, that's right. So I think the direction that they've gone in so far with the slides I quoted earlier is a positive way to think about things. Is that, you know, it's all very well looking at individual markets, individual microeconomic industries, as we've done traditionally, but we should at least be aware of what's happening in the aggregate, so across all markets, because it could be that you're focusing a lot on the you know, you don't see the wood for the trees, so to speak. You're focusing a lot on the trees, and you don't see what's happening overall in the economy. So that's really what they're doing by issuing this commission to the CMA to try to actually track what's happening to market power in aggregate in the UK. And then you can, of course, break it down into which industries are driving that in particular. And there's lots of more complicated things like, are we defining the right markets and all that sort of thing. But at least the first step is just to get measures of market power in the aggregate rather than focusing on individual industries. And that's the step that's been taken so far. And then it's really down to competition authorities to decide and measure up the age-old trade-off, the innovative advantages of size or concentration versus the negative implications on other competitors and this sort of thing.
Thanks, Anthony. We got another question, and okay, this is from Michael. And could the V-shaped recovery in June be similar to what we saw post-Great Recession, where employees being made redundant started new companies and they maintained until more regular employment was available again? If this is the case, could we expect this to be a drag on productivity in the short term? It's a very good question.
Yeah, it's more of a comment than a question. I mean, yes, what you say, it could if people are setting up inefficiently small-sized firms because they don't have employment in larger firms, that could create a drag on productivity. But yeah, it's a great comment and something we should note down, especially the analog with the Great Recession. Thanks.
Okay, right. So we are getting towards the end of our webinar. So I wanted to ask you, Anthony, you have been the recipient of one of the small projects awarded by PIN. So do you want to tell us about your experience? How was it working with PIN?
It was great. So I was fortunate in that I kind of got involved with PIN through the early ECR, early career researcher network. They hosted a couple of open days where you could go and meet other people interested in productivity and this sort of thing. And from that, we did, I think I gave some presentations on my work and got some small funding, and then subsequently applied for a larger amount of funding. It was still a small grant, but larger than the original one, to investigate the work further based on the initial kind of proof of concept work I did with the smaller grant. And then things grew from there. So in that sense, it's been good, and all interactions have been positive, well organized, and all that sort of thing. So it seems like a great initiative.
Okay, thank you very much for this. Okay, so it's almost 1 o'clock, and I would like to remind everybody of the next week webinar. So, oh no, actually it's on 16th of July, sorry for that. So it will be hosted by Daniel Kopasker from Aberdeen and Fabian Wool-Stevens from the Royal Society of Arts Future Work Centre, and it's titled Good Work and Mental Health in the Post-COVID Era. And thank you very much.